Podcast Episode 1. The Playground, What the Beijing Summit Actually Told Us. Stay in the Room, International Edition runtime, approximately 10 minutes. Last week, Chinese state media published a cartoon. Trump, drawn as an inflated orange balloon, puffed up, arms spread, chest out, floating above a podium in the Great Hall of the People. Xi Jinping standing beside him, calm, one hand behind his back, the other holding a pin. The caption in 4 Chinese characters reads, Buji, Zhiyu Fenkun, no rush. Everything in its proper proportion. That cartoon is the summit. Everything I'm going to say in the next 10 minutes is the evidence that the cartoon is correct. Let's start with why Trump was in Beijing in the first place. He went because he had to. He arrived from a position of structural weakness that the summit was designed to perform out of existence, and could not. The Iran war has depleted American military stockpiles. The Strait of Hormuz blockade has handed China structural leverage over global energy flows it did not possess in 2017. Trump's main economic weapon, tariffs, had been struck down by his own Supreme Court before he landed. His backup tariffs ruled illegal by a federal trade court. His domestic approval sat at 34%. He needed wins he could sell at home before Air Force One refueled. She arrived needing nothing. So what did Trump get? The 3 BS. Boeing. Beef. Beans. China agreed to purchase 200 Boeing aircraft. The markets had been expecting 500. Boeing's stock dropped 4% on the announcement. That's the market, not ideologically committed, not interested in spin, pricing the actual value of what was exchanged. In 2017, Trump's first China trip produced deals worth over $250 billion and 300 Boeing planes. This time, 17 executives, a substantially smaller deal total, and the market's registering disappointment. The trajectory is not subtle. What she got was architecture. He got peer recognition on global television, framed in the language of constructive strategic stability, language Trump's own State Department adopted by the end of the visit. He got the G2 frame on the record. He invoked the Thucydides trap in Trump's presence, the historical concept that rising powers and established powers tend to stumble into catastrophic conflict, and Trump's response was to praise Xi for stating it elegantly and pivot blame for any American decline onto Biden. Xi was speaking to history. Trump was managing Truth Social. That gap is not a personality difference. It is a systems difference. And Xi's foreign minister, Wang Yi, went on the record afterwards stating that Beijing sensed Trump understood China's position on Taiwan, that the US does not support or accept Taiwan moving toward independence. That phrasing has not been refuted by the US side. Trump himself told Fox News that Taiwan would be very smart to cool it a little bit, observed accurately but not usefully, that Taiwan is 59 miles from China and 9,500 miles from the United States. Days later, the planned $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan was thrown into question, with Trump suggesting it might not be necessary, since Xi doesn't want to see a war. That is the most significant retreat from American strategic ambiguity on Taiwan in decades. It happened not through formal policy change, but through accumulated public statements that have gone uncontested and will harden into precedent. Now here's the thing. International press did not connect. On the same days, May 14 and 15, while Trump was performing partnership with China in Beijing, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth halted the deployment of 4,000 American troops to Poland. After the troops were all announced withdrawals from Germany and the removal of long-range missile capability from Europe altogether. Congress was not consulted. NATO allies were not consulted. Republican chairs of both armed services committees described themselves as surprised and angry. The two moves, Beijing and Poland, are not contradictory. They are the same move. Eastward toward China, peer partnership. Westward toward Europe, structural withdrawal. Europe was not the table for either decision. Here's what I think is the deepest structural fact about the summit. The two men in the room were operating on entirely different timescales. Xi is playing for the dynastic record. He has consolidated power to a degree unprecedented since Mao. No term limits, no visible successor. His personal political legacy is inseparable from China's civilizational trajectory. Trump is 78 years old. He has no political legacy project in the civilizational sense. He has a brand, a movement, a commercial empire his family will inherit. The presidency, on the available evidence, is being operated as the most powerful commercial leverage position in human history. UFC ticket sponsorships at over $1 million each. 3,700 stock trades in the first quarter of 2026 alone, including an Nvidia, whose H200 chips were simultaneously being approved for Chinese tech firms. Eric Trump in Beijing exploring a chip deal with a company US lawmakers allege has ties to the Chinese Communist Party. The IRS lawsuit settled for a $1.7 billion fund to compensate Trump allies. Paul Krugman put it this way: he might as well have been walking around Beijing with a sign that said, "Bribe me." A president who is primarily motivated by personal enrichment during a finite window of power is, from an adversarial perspective, the most manageable version of American leadership imaginable. You know exactly what he wants. You know his timescale. You know his pressure points. You can offer him things that satisfy his immediate needs while extracting strategic concessions that outlast his presidency by decades. That's what happened in Beijing. The other was playing the slot machine and calling it chess. Now, here's the deeper strop picture. The financial analyst Patrick Boyle has done the most precise work on why the economic dimension of this summit was always going to underdeliver. He draws on the economist Michael Pettis. Trade imbalances between the US and China are not a policy problem better negotiators could fix. They are the automatic byproduct of two domestic economic structures neither side is willing to change. China suppresses household consumption through what's called financial repression. Low savings rates, weak labor protections, undervalued currency, transferring wealth from households to state-favored manufacturers. Because Chinese citizens earn less than they produce, domestic consumption can't absorb the output. The surplus has to go somewhere. It goes into global markets as a trade deficit for whoever absorbs it. The United States, as holder of the world's reserve currency, absorbs about half of global excess savings. By accounting definition, not by policy choice, when that capital floods in, the US must run a corresponding trade deficit. Tariffs cannot fix this. Summits cannot fix this. The 3BS cannot fix this. Historical precedents for imbalances this size. The 1920s. The 1985 Plaza Accord. The 2008 financial crisis. They don't resolve through amicable diplomacy. They resolve through crisis. The 1920s resolved through depression and World War. 2008 is still reshaping Western politics 15 years later. The analysts Warburg and Kurzin add the necessary complication. Complete decoupling between the US and China is not a policy option. It's a functional impossibility. The Western lifestyle is anchored to Chinese manufacturing. Chinese wealth is anchored to a dollar-backed trading system secured by the US Navy. China's demographic survival depends on Taiwanese semiconductor fabs that a Chinese military operation against Taiwan would destroy. These two superpowers are structurally handcuffed to each other. The summit was strategic reconnaissance between two overleveraged, exhausted giants feeling each other out, because neither could afford a bar fight. This is the mountain. The summit was two men arguing about the weather on its lower slopes. So where does this leave Europe? Here's where the convergence across independent analysts becomes the argument itself. Anne Applebaum gave a speech in Vienna's Judenplatz on May 14, the same day Trump was in Beijing. The Judenplatz is the site of the medieval Viennese Jewish community, of a Holocaust memorial, of a statue of Lessing, the philosopher of religious tolerance that the Nazis destroyed and Vienna rebuilt. She spoke on Europe Day, which is also the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. What she said was this: Russia wants a Europe of law replaced by a Europe tolerant of kleptocracy. A Europe where every country can be separately pressured, separately threatened, separately bought. The Trump administration wants a Europe totally dependent on American technology, susceptible to American political control. Both want a weaker, more fragmented Europe. Both use civilizational language as cover for what are ultimately commercial and political objectives. You cannot celebrate European civilization while attacking the legal and political order invented here. The American historian Heather Cox Richardson documented the domestic context. A president conducting thousands of stock trades, firing 20 inspectors general, overseeing $50 billion in identified waste, pardoning over 70 donors convicted of fraud. Peter Zeihan, standing in an Italian cave named the Energy Vector. Europe imports nearly 90% of its natural gas. Pre-Ukraine war, supply was balanced across 4 sources. 2 of those 4 are now gone. Russian flows stopped with the war. Qatari LNG disrupted by the Hormuz blockade. US LNG fills much of the gap. And now the US ambassador to Europe, Andrew Posner, has explicitly threatened to halt LNG exports to the continent if European negotiators don't accept American terms on auto tariffs. The same country withdrawing military protection from Europe's eastern flank is threatening to turn off its gas supply if Europe doesn't accept American terms on cars. And while all this was happening, the BRICS foreign ministers met in New Delhi, on the same days as the Beijing summit. The meeting failed to produce a joint statement. The Iran-UAE structural contradiction, one a victim of the US war, one a partner of the country prosecuting it, made coherent collective position impossible. The alternative architecture to Western dominance contains, within its own institutions, the same contradictions that prevent coherent opposition to the order it claims to be replacing. China extracted maximum value from both events simultaneously. G2 partnership in Beijing, Global South leadership in New Delhi. Neither position requiring the other to cohere. Here is what the strategic clock is measuring. The window between now and approximately 2029 to 2030 is the period during which Russian military opportunity overlaps with European defense unreadiness and American strategic unreliability. I call this the dead spot. 5 specific Russian conventional attack scenarios are now being planned around by NATO's eastern flank: Svalbard, the Åland Islands, eastern Estonia, Gotland, the Suwalki Gap. They become more plausible, not less, as American conventional deterrence withdraws. The structural outcome of reduced US support for Ukraine, military overstretch into the Persian Gulf, and energy leverage threats against European allies is identical whether the result of deliberate design or catastrophic incompetence. The distinction is operationally irrelevant. What matters is what Europe builds before the window closes. The Greenland confrontation earlier this year demonstrated that the response can work. Denmark withdrew tactically from high-profile forums, delegated public mediation to NATO, prepared the EU's anti-coercion instrument, a regulatory mechanism designed to trigger symmetrical punitive tariffs against coercing economies. The combination of quiet diplomacy and credible destructive threat raised the cost of US action beyond what the administration was willing to pay. That's the template. Quiet preparation of counter-architecture before the public confrontation. Launch it credibly when the coercion becomes overt. The transactional power takes the face-saving exit because proceeding costs more than the symbolic win. Continental Europe is imperfectly and unevenly building this. None of it is complete. All of it is directionally correct. The question is whether the building can be finished in the time available. So here's where I'll leave you. The Beijing summit was not a meeting between equals. It was strategic reconnaissance between 2 overleveraged powers, one playing for the dynastic record and one playing for the next news cycle. Both structurally handcuffed by mutual economic dependency, neither can publicly acknowledge. The architecture they sketched, the G-2 frame, the strategic stability language, the implicit Taiwan ambiguity, the managed competition, is the world Europe will have to operate in for the next generation. The decisions made in that room will land on the parties not in the room, regardless of consent. What we have right now is not hope. Hope is not yet analytically available. What we have is determination and a closing window. The work is difficult. Success is not guaranteed. The reward, if it comes, is the preservation of a system within which hope might eventually become possible again. That is more than the alternative. The mountain doesn't care about the summit communique. The mountain is what Europe is now being asked to climb, without the guide it relied on for 70 years, in weather it did not predict, with equipment it is still assembling. Two playground aren't going to stop fighting to let Europe prepare. The class is watching. The teacher has left the room. The sanctions for spectatorship are accumulating quietly, and they will land on the watchers regardless of who throws the next punch. This is the world now. The question of what Europe does with it has not yet been answered. The question of what Britain does with it, given that Britain shares the strategic predicament and has specifically disabled some of its own capacity to respond, is the subject of the next episode. Stay in the room. Production note.